If your last name is Greek, there is a chance it once meant something far more dangerous than a name on a passport. Some of these names were carried by priests who governed whole communities under foreign rule. Others belonged to generals who ruled provinces, rebels who lit a revolution, and one royal house that watched an empire fall after 11 long centuries. One name on this list belonged to the last emperor who ever ruled from Constantinople. If that name is yours, you are not just Greek. You may be carrying the final name spoken before an empire ended. Number 20. Papadopoulos. It means son of a priest, and under centuries of Ottoman rule, that was not a soft religious title reserved for spiritual matters alone. The Orthodox Church was granted real administrative authority over Greek Christian communities under what was known as the millet system, collecting taxes, running courts, settling disputes, and negotiating directly with Ottoman officials on behalf of entire villages that had no other formal representation. A family carrying this name was historically associated with that quiet, constant authority, the kind that governed daily life, marriage records, and local justice, while foreign soldiers controlled the streets outside, and foreign law technically ruled the land. Church records across Greek communities preserve this name attached to exactly this administrative role, appearing again and again in registers that predate any modern Greek state by centuries. Not every name on this list served behind a pulpit, though. One served behind a forge. In a trade, foreign rulers tried hard to restrict. Number 19. Sideropoulos, son of an ironworker. Under Ottoman rule, Christian communities faced real restrictions on producing weapons, which made ironworking a politically sensitive trade, watched closely by authorities who feared armed rebellion. A family bearing this name operated inside exactly that tension, producing tools the empire needed, while living under suspicion of producing something more dangerous. Guild and tax records preserve the name tied to this exact trade. Most people never hear that part. Metal and scripture were one kind of power in this world. Command over entire provinces was another kind entirely. Number 18. Strategopoulos. From Strategos, a Byzantine general. This is where the story turns political rather than religious or economic. Byzantine generals did not simply lead armies. Many governed entire provinces called themes, combining military command with civil administration in a single office. A family carrying this name was historically associated with that dual authority, the kind that could raise an army and collect its own taxes in the same breath. Byzantine administrative records preserve this office and the families who held it. If this is your name, the records point toward real provincial power. Provincial command is one kind of authority. What follows belonged to a scholar whose flight from a falling city helped ignite an entirely different world. Number 17. Argyropoulos, son of a silversmith. But this name carries a real documented figure behind it. John Argyropoulos was a Byzantine scholar who fled to Renaissance Italy as Constantinople came under threat, carrying Greek learning westward at the exact moment it was needed most. Families bearing this name were often associated with scholarship and craftsmanship at once, a combination that let some members cross borders that soldiers could not. Historical records document his teaching in Florence, influencing a generation of Italian scholars. Most people never hear that part. Scholarship carried this family across a border. A completely different kind of survival carried the next one across centuries in the mountains instead. Number 16. Vlachos. This name marks descent from the Vlach or Aromanian shepherd communities, a real and historically distinct ethnic group scattered through the Greek-speaking mountains, following transhumant herding routes that predate most written records in the region by centuries, and stretched across borders that modern maps would later cut straight through their pastures. A family bearing this name was not simply Greek by default, absorbed quietly into the surrounding population. They carried a separate linguistic and cultural thread woven into the broader Greek world, one that survived centuries of shifting borders, competing empires, and later nationalist pressure to assimilate into a single identity. Ethnographic and historical surveys still document distinct Vlach communities today, their language and customs preserved in mountain villages, long after the empires that once ruled over them disappeared entirely. If this is your name, the old migration routes point toward the mountains, not the cities. Herding routes kept this people moving for centuries. A different people built their homes inside solid stone instead, for a very good reason. Number 15. Kastrenakis. From Castro, a fortress. This is a Cretan name, tied to island communities that built and defended fortified towns against Ottoman incursions and the constant threat of pirate raids across the Aegean. A family bearing this name was historically associated with exactly this kind of defensive settlement. The walls that decided whether a coastal community survived the next raid or didn't. Cretan land and defense records preserve the name attached to these fortified positions. Most people never hear that part. Step away from the coastline now, though, because what comes next carries real weight worn by a conqueror long before it was worn by anyone else. Number 14. Alexandridas, son of Alexander. Here is where the story needs real care. This name does not prove descent from Alexander the Great himself. What it does carry, honestly, is a naming tradition so old and so widespread across the Greek world that it reflects just how deeply his memory shaped Greek identity for over 2,000 years afterward. Historical naming patterns show the name spreading across regions with no direct connection to Macedon at all, purely through cultural inheritance. If this is your name, the records are not claiming royal blood. They are recording something almost as remarkable. A legend so powerful, it became an ordinary surname. Ancient legend explains this name. A tragedy barely a century old explains the one that follows. Number 13. Georgiadis. A common patronymic, but for many families bearing it, the real history is not ancient at all. Large numbers of Georgiadis families trace back to Cappadocian Greek communities, uprooted during the 1923 population exchange between Greece and Turkey, a documented and devastating displacement that reshaped where millions of Greek families actually lived. Migration and resettlement records preserve exactly this movement. Most people never hear that part, assuming every Greek surname points backward into antiquity when some point toward a 20th century tragedy instead. Displacement explains this family's story. Direct answerability to a sultan explains the next family's entirely. Number 12. Mavrogenes. This is where the list stops speculating and starts naming documented history. The Mavrogenes family were real Phanariote Greeks, an elite class permitted to hold high administrative office under Ottoman rule specifically because of their education and connections. Nicholas Mavrogenes served as an actual prince of Wallachia in the 1780s, a genuine ruling position granted by the Ottoman court itself. Families bearing this name were named participants in real regional governance, not distant observers of power. Ottoman and Wallachian court records preserve this appointment directly. Serving a sultan was one path to influence. Refusing to serve anyone at all was a very different one, and it belongs to what comes next. Number 11. Ypsilantis. This name changes the entire tone of the list. Alexander Ypsilantis led the 1821 uprising that lit the spark of the Greek War of Independence, crossing into the Danubian principalities with an armed force in an act that directly triggered the war that would eventually free Greece from centuries of Ottoman rule. Families bearing this name carry a documented connection to the single most consequential act of rebellion in modern Greek history. Historical accounts of the revolution preserve his name at its exact starting point. If this is your name, the records are not implying resistance. They are recording where it began. Rebellion is one way to shape a nation's birth. Governing it afterward is another, and that task fell to the family that follows. Number 10. Mavrokordatos. Another powerful Phanariote dynasty. But this family's story does not end with the Ottomans. A Mavrokordatos became the first head of state of independent Greece, carrying a family name forward from Ottoman-era administration directly into the leadership of a newly freed nation. That is a rare kind of continuity, a name that survived the transition from empire to revolution to statehood without losing its influence at any stage. Early Greek state records preserve this transition directly. Most people never hear that part. Politics built one legacy. What comes next was earned entirely on the battlefield by the man they called the Old Man of the Morea. Number 9. Kolokotronis. Theodoros Kolokotronis was one of the most important military commanders of the Greek War of Independence, a guerrilla leader whose campaigns in the Peloponnese helped turn the tide of the revolution. Families bearing this name carry a direct connection to the battlefield side of Greek independence, not its diplomacy or its politics. War records and later Greek state commemorations preserve his campaigns in detail. If this is your name, the records point toward the mountains where the revolution was actually fought and won. The battlefield is one kind of proof. What comes next takes the story back nearly 6 centuries earlier into the heart of a dying empire. Number 8. Kantakouzenos, a Byzantine noble house that produced an actual emperor, John VI, who ruled Constantinople during one of the empire's most turbulent civil conflicts. Families bearing this name were not simply wealthy Byzantine nobles standing at a distance from the throne. They were named participants in imperial politics at the very top, court records, imperial decrees, and dynastic marriages. That is a documented dynasty, not a naming tradition built on suggestion. If this is your name, the records are recording imperial history directly. This family sat on the throne itself. What follows belonged to an empire that refused to disappear even after its capital fell. Number 7. Lascaris. When Constantinople fell to the Fourth Crusade, in 1204, the Byzantine Empire did not simply end. The Lascaris family founded the Empire of Nicaea, a genuine government in exile that preserved Byzantine rule in Anatolia until Constantinople was eventually recaptured decades later. Families bearing this name carry a connection to one of history's most remarkable acts of political survival, an empire that refused to accept its own capital's fall as the end of the story. Byzantine historical records document this exile government in detail. Most people never hear that part. Exile is one kind of survival. Ruling from the throne itself, more than once, is another, and that belongs to the dynasty that follows. Number 6. Ducas. One of the most powerful Byzantine imperial families, producing multiple emperors across different centuries of Byzantine history rather than a single brief reign. Families bearing this name were historically associated with the very center of Byzantine imperial power, appearing repeatedly in dynastic marriages, court appointments, and the imperial succession itself. Byzantine chronicles preserve this name attached to the throne again and again. If this is your name, the records are not hinting at nobility somewhere in the background. They are recording it at the highest possible level, repeatedly. Repetition at the top is one kind of power. What follows belonged to the dynasty ruling when the empire made its most fatal mistake. Number 5. Angelos. This Byzantine imperial dynasty ruled from 1185 until 1204, the exact years leading up to the disaster of the Fourth Crusade, when the empire's weakened state and internal rivalries left Constantinople vulnerable to a crusader army that was supposed to be marching toward Jerusalem instead. Families bearing this name carry a connection to one of the most consequential failures in Byzantine history, the reign that historians still point to when explaining how the unthinkable happened. Byzantine records preserve this dynasty's fall in detail. Most people never hear that part. Failure is one legacy. Rebuilding an entire second empire from the wreckage is a very different one, and it belongs to the dynasty that follows. Number 4. Komnenos. This dynasty did more than rule Byzantium for decades. After a family branch fled the chaos following the Fourth Crusade, the Komnenoi founded the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, a genuine independent Greek empire that remarkably outlasted Constantinople itself by 8 years before finally falling to the Ottomans. Families bearing this name carry a connection to two separate empires, not one, a level of political survival almost no other dynasty on this list can claim. Byzantine and Trapezuntine records preserve both empires in detail. If this is your name, the records point toward an empire built from the wreckage of another one. Two empires is a rare kind of survival. What follows belongs to a single man who built modern Greece with his own hands, centuries later. Number 3. Venizelos. This is where the story steps out of the distant past and into living memory. Eleftherios Venizelos was the architect of the modern Greek state, a political leader whose reforms and diplomacy in the early 20th century shaped the borders and institutions of Greece as it exists today. Families bearing this name carry a connection to nation-building that happened within documented, recent history, not medieval legend. 20th century state records and international treaties preserve his role directly. Most people never hear that part, assuming every powerful Greek name must belong to antiquity. Before the very last name on this list, though, one more belongs to the empire everyone here ultimately served, one way or another. Number 2. Notaras. Lucas Notaras held the title of Megas Dou, the empire's last Grand Duke, commanding its navy and standing among the final circle of officials inside Constantinople as Ottoman forces closed in during the spring of 1453, when the city's fall was no longer a distant fear but a matter of weeks. He is documented as one of the last men to negotiate on the empire's behalf before the city fell, reportedly clashing with other officials over whether union with the Western Church was worth the price it demanded, and he was executed shortly afterward on the direct orders of the conquering sultan, along with members of his own family. Families bearing this name carry a connection to the empire's final administrative core, Not its throne, but the machinery of navy, negotiation, and governance that kept it running until the very last days before the walls gave way. Byzantine and Ottoman conquest records both preserve his role and his execution in unusually specific detail for the period, down to the order in which the executions were carried out. Most people never hear that part. But the very last name on this list belonged to the man who wore the crown itself when the walls finally gave way. Number 1. Palaiologos. Say it slowly, because this is the name that changes the scale of everything. The Palaiologos dynasty was the last imperial house of Byzantium, ruling Constantinople until its final emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died defending the city's walls when it fell to Ottoman forces in 1453, ending an empire that had lasted for over 1,000 years. A surname built from this family does not merely gesture toward Byzantine heritage the way other entries on this list carefully do. It carries the name of the very last emperor to rule from Constantinople, preserved in Byzantine chronicles, Ottoman conquest records, and documented history still taught in schools across the world today. The name does not prove that every modern bearer descends from Constantine XI himself, but historically, it belongs to the family whose fall marked the actual end of the Roman world in the East, 1,000 years after most people assume Rome had already disappeared. Of every name on this list, this is the one that reaches the furthest, because it reaches for the exact moment an ancient world ended and the modern one began. 20 names, 20 different doors into the same vast world of priests who governed under foreign rule, ironworkers watched by suspicious empires, generals who ruled provinces the size of small kingdoms, scholars who carried learning across a collapsing border, revolutionaries who lit a spark that freed a nation, statesmen who built modern states from the wreckage of old empires, and one dynasty that watched a 1,000-year empire fall around them in a single generation. A surname is never just a label sitting quietly on a document, filled in without a second thought by someone who never asked where it came from. It is a compressed history, carrying pieces of empires that once stretched across 3 continents, revolutions that were fought in real mountains by real people with real names, and a fall so significant that historians still use it to mark the end of an entire age of the world. If one of these names is yours, you are not just looking at a family tree stretching backward on a screen. You are looking at a fragment of an empire, a revolution, or a fall that changed the world, carried forward by people who never called themselves historians, just survivors who kept a name alive through conquest, exile, displacement, and the slow rebuilding of a nation from its own ashes. Comment your surname below, along with the region or island your family traces back to, and tell me which forgotten name, dynasty, or empire you want decoded next. Because somewhere out there, another ordinary name is still waiting to be traced all the way back to a throne, a battlefield, or the final hour of an empire that once ruled half the known world.